Hi, I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about how you can change the settings in the new Leica M10-R. So when my nice new Leica M10-R arrived in its shiny box the other day, the first thing I always do is I check the menu settings, because by default they're not always the way I prefer to shoot. So let me just show you how I set the camera up in the office before I came out shooting here in Noosa National Park in Queensland. If there's one thing Leica does really well, it's boxes for their cameras, but this is not an unboxing video, so I'm just going to take him straight out. So this is the Leica M10-R. I'm going to make a rustling noise for a sec. There we are. Let's put this out of the way over here. So what this video is all about, of course, is the menu settings. So I'm just going to turn on the camera now, and let's just get into the menus. And the first menu that you'll see is the favorites, and you can see here where it says favorites. I'll just put that down so it's nice and steady for you to see. Okay. The favorites can be chosen later in the menus. This is like a shortcut to functions that you use fairly frequently. So I'm just going to go down to the bottom here and go to main menu. Now that takes you into the main menu, obviously, that's why it's called main menu. And I'll just show a quick shortcut to that. So if I hit menu and then menu again, that skips the favorites and takes you into the main menu itself. The favorites are very handy. I'll show you how to choose those items in a sec. This camera is straight out of the box, and all of the items that you see listed in these menus are the way the camera comes from the factory. So there's a few things I want to change. So I'm just going to go through them one at a time and either leave them alone if they're okay, or I'm going to change them to my own personal preferred settings. Now please, this is just the way I operate. You may choose to do things slightly differently. Drive mode, I shoot a lot of my images on single shot, but this is where you would also choose the low speed shooting, the high speed shooting, time-lapse shooting, exposure bracketing, and self-timer 2 and 12 seconds. I do use self-timer quite frequently when I'm shooting on a tripod. I don't have a cable release for this camera, so the 2-second self-timer is a nice way to work when you do have the camera on a tripod and you want a really stable shot. Something else I do a lot of with all of my cameras is exposure bracketing, and in this option, if you just click the right arrow here, it will take you into a choice of 3, 5, or 3 or 5. You could just cycle through the two choices, images, and then you can choose the steps between them, which is 1, 2, or 3 steps. I find 3 shots at 2 stops between them seems to work beautifully. And you can also set some exposure compensation which combines with those 3 shots so that the whole sequence doesn't have to be centered around 0. So your mileage may vary with that, as they say, but I find that 2 stops of exposure variation and 3 shots themselves give me what I need for a good exposure bracket. So that's a -2, a 0, and a +2. Works for me. Okay, back into the menus, continuing. Drive mode. Exposure metering is set to multi-field. Let's leave that one alone because that's where I like to use it. Feel free to use the others, but in my experience, multi-field gets you pretty close pretty quickly, and that's all I need. Exposure compensation is off. We don't need to access exposure compensation in this particular spot. We'll have it on this wheel here, and I'll show you how to set that in a second. Flash settings, I'm not using flash, so there's no need to go into that one. ISO setup is interesting. If we go into there, this allows you to set a manual ISO in the menu, which is in addition to being able to set the ISO here. Now this one only goes up to 6,400. So if you want to go further, you can set your ISO right the way up to long way, 50,000. So that's how you would access the much higher ISOs. Personally, I don't go above 6400 very often, but certainly with the new M10R, you can go up to 12,500 without too much trouble, and maybe a little bit of noise reduction work done later. So let me just pop out of that menu there. Maximum auto ISO. This is for the auto ISO setting, which of course is on here, on A on the little dial. That gives you the longest time that you're comfortable with. That's the highest ISO that you're comfortable with shooting before it maxes out. Now I'm going to set it at 3000. I'm going to set it at 6400 in this particular case. So that's the maximum ISO the camera will use on auto ISO. And since we're talking about auto ISO, I should mention the maximum exposure time, not the maximum ISO, the maximum exposure time, which means the lowest shutter speed that the camera will use before it starts to push up the auto ISO. So 1 over the focal length, f being focal length, 1 over 50 makes it a 50th of a second. So a 50 millimeter lens would be a 50th of a second as your lowest shutter speed, or in real terms, a 60th of a second is the closest one. And what that means is that when the exposure drops to a 60th, instead of it going lower to a 30th to a 15th and so on, it will start to push up the ISO instead. So it's a really nice way to protect yourself against inadvertent camera shake. It's also based on the focal length of the lens, so that a wider angle lens you can probably shoot at a slightly lower shutter speed, whereas a telephoto lens you should probably start going up the ISO settings and using a slightly higher shutter speed, like 125th if you were using a 90mm lens and so on. So that's really nice. You can have it as twice the focal length if you're being a little bit more, if you're feeling a bit shaky one day, or even 4 times the focal length. Plus, of course, you can lock it at a certain shutter speed. And a lot of street photographers use auto ISO and their shutter speed locked at a minimum of a 500th or a 250th. So when things are happening really quickly, they're guaranteed of getting a sharp picture. So auto ISO is well worth experimenting with, and I find it's very useful in many situations. But do bear in mind that having a minimum shutter speed is only going to protect you against camera shake, unless it's quite a high minimum shutter speed, like a 500th. Subject movement is a different thing entirely. So if you're using that minimum shutter speed as a function of the focal length, then you'll probably find that no matter how high you set that, even at 4 times the focal length, if you were shooting with a 24mm lens at 4 times the focal length, that's still only a 100th of a second, and that absolutely won't freeze movement of people moving quickly in front of you in street photography. In those circumstances, you'd be better off choosing a fixed shutter speed for your auto ISO settings. White balance, I prefer to choose daylight for my white balance when that's appropriate. Auto white balance is fine up to a point, and we are shooting raw, as we'll see in a sec. And if you're shooting raw, it doesn't really matter what the white balance is. It only really affects the view on the screen here, which can be a bit disconcerting. And when you've got very strong colors and the auto white balance tries to remove those colors, seeing a problem rather than actually a color you want to keep. So my habit is to shoot on daylight, but if you do use auto, don't worry too much about it. The only time it will be a major problem is if you shoot JPEGs and you set the wrong white balance here, like tungsten for outdoors or daylight for indoors, then you really are in trouble. Auto white balance is probably more recommended for JPEGs, but for raw files, still you can use that because you can change it later, but it's probably my preference to shoot daylight. That's just a habit I've got into over the years. It's by no means set in stone. File format, as I say, DNG. You can shoot DNG plus JPEG if you wish. If you're shooting with the camera in monochrome mode, then you might want to have a black and white JPEG and a color DNG file. That's something that can be quite useful. Personally, I just leave it in DNG and leave it alone. Okay, next page. And if you look carefully, there's a little white bar under my finger there. And as I've gone down the pages, it's just moved down a step. So there's 4 pages to look at, and we're on page 2 at the moment. JPEG settings are only obviously important when you're shooting JPEGs. Gosh, if you're just shooting RAW, then none of this has any effect except for the view on the rear screen. So if you set your JPEGs to be contrasty and quite heavily saturated, you will see that reflected on the screen, but the raw file, of course, will not be affected by that. So it's just really part of the previewing mechanism when you're shooting raw files, but you need to adjust the JPEG settings to get the picture on the back to change. And this is also where you would choose to shoot in black and white mode, monochrome on, monochrome off. Again, contrast will affect that. If you are shooting JPEGs, I would also strongly recommend that you turn the sharpness down because it can be a little aggressive, and the last thing you want to do is be locked into a very strong sharpening effect. If you're making prints, you're better to do your print sharpening in post rather than in camera. Auto review, now this is defaulting to 5 seconds. This means that when you take the picture, the image will show on the rear screen for 5 seconds. Or if you're using the electronic viewfinder up here, it will be in the viewfinder in front of your eye for 5 seconds. My preference is to turn this off, or if you really need to see that picture immediately, change it to hold, and then until you release the shutter button, so shoot and hold, then the image will appear in the rear screen or in the viewfinder. My preference is to turn it off. I'm not a big fan of chimping pictures immediately. You never know what might happen next, so you might miss something. So you can always look at them later. So turn that off or use hold. Capture assistance. Whoops, it didn't register, did it? There we go. Off and set. There it is, says off. Capture assistance. Focus peaking. This puts a little red overlay on the subject when you're using the rear LCD screen or the electronic viewfinder, and it shows you the highest contrast part of the picture, which is very useful for identifying focus. That can be very effective. I often shoot with the histogram on. Not critical, because exposure clipping I find more useful, and this gives you a blue overlay for dark or black areas and a red overlay for the white overlay for the highlight clipping. The lower limit is not really useful because this is all based on JPEGs, and a RAW file has much more shadow detail. So I prefer to set that to 0, then go down to upper limit and set that to 254. And that means that anything that's 255 or brighter will be flashing white in the electronic viewfinder or on the screen on the back. And that gives you a clue that some highlights are overexposed, and how you deal with that is up to you. Probably some exposure compensation later on. So that seems to work quite well there. Grids, turn them on or off, up to you. Exposure simulation, I prefer to have that on permanent rather than half press, so that as I change the exposure, any view I have in the electronic viewfinder or in live view on the back will be actually represented or reflected in the way the picture looks. If you have it the other way, it tends to normalize out until you press the shutter button, and then it either gets lighter or darker. So you could try that and see which way works for you, but personally I like to leave that on permanent. Focus aid automatic, that is when you move the focus ring on the lens and you're in, and it magnifies the view so that you can see it again on the rear screen or in the viewfinder. Very little of this has anything to do with the rangefinder window. This is really to do with the electronic viewfinder's rear or on the top. Level gauge, I have a bit of a tendency to shoot my pictures slightly wonky. I don't know why, it's just something seems to happen. So having the level gauge on is useful. And again, that appears on the rear screen or in the electronic viewfinder, not in the rangefinder window. So I'm going to turn that on and then go to the next screen, which is screen number 3. And go down, oops, sorry, my bad, capture assistance. We're in there, we're out, okay, back into the main menu. Electronic viewfinder display control. You can have the image that you shot appear in the viewfinder or on the rear screen automatically or manually. So you can play around with these and set the camera up to the way you want it to work. User profiles. If you are in the habit of shooting with the camera in quite different modes, for instance, monochrome and color, you can save the way your camera is set up as a user profile. So one thing that can work quite well is to have the camera set up on normal settings for the way you normally shoot, save that as setting 1, and then a second setting where you change those JPEG settings to monochrome so that you can shoot in black and white. And that means that you can go directly into the user profiles to change to black and white, rather than having to drill down into the JPEG settings and then choose monochrome. It's not that much quicker, but it's kind of neat and tidy. So you can use those. Also, when you upgrade firmware, you can save the way your camera is set up. So all these adjustments I'm making can be saved, and then they can be stored onto a card when you do your firmware upgrade, and then restored when the firmware upgrade is finished. So you don't have to go back and change all those settings again. Customize control, edit favorites. Now I did mention that at the beginning. There's a list here. As I just click from edit favorites, click the little arrow, I get this big long list here, and they say on or off, and you'll see there's many pages. I think there's 4. So if I go all the way, I can just scroll down. There's all sorts of settings here. Whatever is on will appear in that favorites menu, and whatever is off won't. So you can choose whatever you want to sit up in that favorites menu as your sort of shortcut to menu items. By default, it's whatever we had at the beginning, and that you can adjust to your own taste. Customize wheel, by default that's off and it's referring to this wheel here. My preference for this one is exposure compensation. If you like, you can, if you're using the electronic viewfinder or you're using live view a lot, you can dial in magnification for critical focusing. But personally, I find that exposure compensation is a really useful setting for this wheel, because then you can just dial it in as you need it. It's really good. Display brightness, I tend to take that off auto because it actually will vary, and if the light levels in this room change now, this will get brighter or darker, and I don't like that. So I'm going to sit it on medium. You can see it happening now. They're on medium, and so the same with the EVF. If you have one, I'll set that on medium. Okay, next one. I'm just going to make sure I've not missed anything here. Auto review, EVS brightness, next one here, auto power saving 2 minutes, that seems reasonable. Leica photos off, date and time, you'll set that when you first turn the camera on. That's useful. I do recommend that you set that accurately, particularly if you have multiple cameras, because there's nothing worse than getting all your images back into Lightroom when you've been shooting with 2 cameras and have them a few hours apart, because then all the pictures don't sort of fit together neatly, and you'll find that you've got chunks of pictures in different parts of the Lightroom catalog layout on the screen, and it's hard to work out which ones are which. So do sync your cameras. Reset camera sets it all back to default. Format card, it's fairly obvious, same as any other camera. You can change your image numbering if you wish. Considering that I do that in Lightroom later, I always change the file name, so not really a big deal. Last one, sensor cleaning. This allows you to open the shutter. I'm not going to do that, I might get some dust on it, but the M10 does have a shutter in front of the sensor, unlike the CL and the SL2, and you need to move that out of the way to get at the sensor. So that's what this does here. You simply choose that option. I won't do it, but hit open shutter and it will open it, so you can clean the sensor and then turn the camera off and it will replace the shutter into its normal position. And camera information is where you will actually change the firmware if we ever have a firmware upgrade, and those do come out periodically. Leica do listen to feedback from their users, so firmware does come out from time to time, and you'll see it's grayed out here because there is no new firmware. So that's the way I like to set my camera up. You may decide to do things differently, and that's completely fine. So my name's Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. I'll leave you with a couple of the photographs I've taken in the last few days, and if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Talk to you again soon.